video is presented by GameMastersForHire.com. Stick around for a special offer. Welcome to the panel where we look at the world through the frame of the comic book, and today we're going to investigate, should superheroes kill? My name is Jason Badower. I'm a comic book writer and artist. I'm currently drawing DC Comics Black Label graphic novel, Joker, Harley, Criminal Sanity, Volume 2. I'm going to bring you back to a conversation that I had with one of my best buddies on the planet, Marvel Living Library, Scott Stuart, who owns every single issue of the Avengers. We're going to do a podcast-style conversation about whether Iron Man should kill, should Wonder Woman and Superman kill. We'll visit Batman killing, which became the basis of my last video, Zack Snyder is wrong about Batman. Then finally, we're going to swing on back to Marvel with Spider-Man and wrap it up with Captain America killing in the first Avenger. Then we're going to take you on a deep dive down the history of comics and why we believe the no-kill rule for superheroes came into existence and how it's affected our superheroes. I am so proud of this conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Let us know what you think in the comments below.
Let's talk about Iron Man, because I was stunned by the amount of killing that Tony Stark did in that movie. For example, in The Escape, when he gets out of the cave, I was able to let that go because he had to do with what he had. There was a desperation. He was very much the underdog in that situation and on limited time and limited resources. But it was when the Mark III landed and he immediately repulses that dude and he flies up into a wall. And I'm like, I think he's going to be all right. And then when he dodges the tank missile and then fires back and he blows up the tank, I'm like, nobody got out of that tank. Suddenly this fresh new take on this character was killing people. And I'm always a big believer of holding up a text to its own internal logic. You have an Iron Man, you have Tony, an arms dealer that suddenly decides that he doesn't want to use his weapons for killing.
Effective immediately, I am shutting down the weapons manufacturer division of Stark International.
Pepper even asks him when he designs the repulsion.
I thought you said you were done making weapons.
Pepper should feel betrayed by what Tony was just doing there. If Tony was using his technology to create non-lethal weaponry, that his legacy evolving from his father's world into the future where you could defend yourself non-lethally would feel like some sort of closing of a circle to me, and would also give the character a real MO and a real difference for what he was doing. Both a mission and a MO's forever lost. Now he's just a man with better weapons than the other guy. He was just another action hero.
It's pretty much the ultimate American fantasy, isn't it? Be the dude with the best weapons and be awesome at it. I absolutely see where you're coming from. I just think they picked a different audience. They picked the audience that goes to movies as opposed to the audience that picks up comic books.
And that brings me to thinking about Wonder Woman. You had William Moulton Marston creating this character as a role model for girls to see a strong woman. And I feel like the late great master George Perez ushered in a mission for the character when he made her an ambassador of peace to man's world. In the same way that Superman had truth, justice in the American way, or truth, justice and a better tomorrow now, and Batman has crime will fear me. Criminals are a cowardly and superstitious lot. George gave her a mission. And the first time I saw a contradiction to that mission was in Alex Ross and Mark Waid's Kingdom Come, where we saw a Wonder Woman in a world without Superman could not quite pick up the slack. And so she was forced to don the armor and the sword and start taking a very extreme view to the justice that she was forced to deal out.
I don't like Wonder Woman with the sword. It's a masculine symbol. It really contradicts what she was created to do. I get the urge to up the warrior in her past for the modern age, and with the Gal Gadot performance that people are seeing on the screen, for the same reason that they tweaked Iron Man in the comics to the Downey Jr. portrayal. They tweaked Wonder Woman in the comics to fit the Gal Gadot portrayal, and as I think they should.
The other moment that I remember that happened in continuity a bit before that was Greg Rucka, who you mentioned, when he had in, I think it was Wonder Woman 219, where she kills Maxwell Lord. Those of you who have seen Wonder Woman 1984, Maxwell Lord was Pedro Pascal's character in Wonder Woman 1984. And in comics, she breaks his neck. He is mind controlling Superman. And the only way to stop Superman from killing Batman is for her to kill him. She then goes into refuge for a year and stuff. But to me, that was the first time where we started seeing Wonder Woman as the extreme response on the Justice League. And later on, Azzarello's run, and then into the future, where Wonder Woman became the warrior, the killer on the team, the one who everybody else had to talk down from an extreme response. And it seemed, I remember once talking to a very prominent Wonder Woman creator who he said something along the lines of, it felt like the boys had gotten their hands on this toy and in trying to make it more accessible to everybody had broken the concept of her in the meantime. For me, my perception of Wonder Woman is that she should be the voice of reason. The last one to throw the punch, the first one to try and engage in diplomacy.
Wonder Woman was created with a bit more of an intent, and it was more whimsical, but the ambassador at peace thing that was codified by Perez, as you mentioned, it is, for me, the definitive aspect of her, and so I absolutely see where you're coming from. On the other hand, the current portrayals, I find actually fit just as well. She's a creature of antiquity, and life and death for immortal beings means different things. The property of mortality is death. It doesn't mean the same thing to even the mortals of that time. And so her being a little more fascistic leaning than the other two actually makes some degree of sense for me as well. But I do prefer the Wonder Woman that values life and values peace.
How do you feel about Superman killing?
I hate Superman killing. I don't mind it happening and it being explored. It happened in like issue 6 of, or 12 or something of John Byrne's Man of Steel reboot era, Superman. So if you look at that as the start of our Superman continuity, he did kill early on and he had huge ramifications on him. He lived Earth for a year. So I don't mind a story that explores it happening and the ramifications of that. But as a rule, no, absolutely, Superman should not kill. The entire point of modern Superman is to be the best of us, the best example. It's not just about being strongest or fastest. It's about being goodest, to deliberately misuse a word. And the goodest of us don't kill. And Superman has all these resources in the same way that Batman does. The point should be to find a way around it and not to give in to that impossible choice. Super in the superheroic comes from doing the impossible, the things that we couldn't do. In that situation, in the train station at the end of Batman versus Superman, the end of Man of Steel, you or I would have had to have grabbed a weapon and shot to save that family. The Superman shouldn't have had to do that.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you that Superman's story is one of resourcefulness in the same way that Batman's is. I think the best Superman stories is when he's put into impossible situations and then manages to come up with the solution that you never, ever saw coming. Probably one of the best examples I could think of is Joe Kelly and Liba Mayhew and Doug Monkey's story, where he fights a version of the Authority with Manchester Black. And the way he defeats them is just brilliant. And it is on a level where he fights 5 versions of Zod all at once and manages to defeat them. So the idea that even I can come up with 2 things that Clark could have done to defeat Zod. Real Clark, he would have come up with 100. And I just feel that the Man of Steel is a failure of the creators to rise to the challenge of Superman rather than Superman failing.
I love that story so much. And Joe Kelly rose to the challenge of Superman with it. It's been adapted by Warner Brothers Animation. For those who don't want to track down the comics, it's a really good story. And the adaptation's pretty literal. But yeah, absolutely love it. It explicitly recanonized the idea of Superman and why it matters in a modern and cynical and gritty age.
I think it's just so important for Superman to show us how we should react to stuff. And when you cast him as the villain, I have incredible respect for Tom Taylor and what he did with Injustice. And there is absolutely no arguing with the incredible success of that comic book. I still struggle with its fundamental premise that Superman would go on a sort of totalitarian rampage after losing Lois Lane, a man who's lost so many people, who's lost his entire planet of people, that his parents, everybody that he loves. He's constantly been faced with loss, that it would take Lois for him to go crazy and kill the joke. I get the concept of it, and I get in that alternate universe that we have a Superman that is not quite pure white, because that's the thing about Superman. He has to remain pure white. And his story is, as you mentioned, the ingenuity of finding a solution, either through internal or external means, to overcome the problem. And in that point, the greatest adversary that Superman would have had to have overcome was grief. To say that Superman cannot get over grief is something that I just don't agree with. But again, that was something that I don't believe that Tom Taylor necessarily came up with. I think perhaps that was the Injustice team. I'm not sure. Anyway, Tom earned it and took that story in just such a wonderful direction.
But I'm always happy to explore a story like that. It's an interesting idea.
Yeah.
The Superman that we are talking about might possibly break for a moment, but he wouldn't stay broken and become evil, world-dominating space Hitler.
I remember Dwayne Johnson in an interview was asked, what is the difference between Black Adam and Superman? And he was like, Black Adam kills. And I was like, dude, have you seen Man of Steel? That is not a point of difference anymore. And that's the problem. When you dilute your pure white, all your commentaries on the idea of what if Superman's power is in another being, and your Homelanders, your Omni-Mans, your Black Adams, these characters don't mean anything anymore because the white is no longer pure white. That's the point of Superman, of finding a way to stay white like that. And all these comparisons depend on that idea, or you're really just dealing with shades of grey. And so to me, Man of Steel is not a Superman. It's just it's this being. I call him Man of Steel.
We do have to remember that these are fictional stories, and they only happen because somebody decided to make it happen that way. There is no good argument that Superman must kill. And you can come up with whatever scenario, but it's then your job to help Superman find the solution to the problem you've created, not throw your hands in and have him just be another strong dude.
And that's again why that Joe Kelly story is just so fantastic. That's the challenge of writing a Superman story. Whatever problem you come up with, you have to come up with a solution that Superman will come up with. I always joke that it takes these heroes 30 seconds or 10 seconds or in 1 second to come up with a solution that takes us months or years as writers to come up with. I just feel that with Zack Snyder, a desire for complexity in cynicism and not in the limitless capacity of the same complexity of Superman's symbol stands for. There is a very strong argument that in Superman 2, he killed all the supervillains. I believe they're just having a little sleep at the bottom of the fortress, all frozen down there. But if someone had said to me that he had killed them, I'd be like, maybe that's a possibility too. The Kryptonian Phantom Zone is a parallel to life imprisonment, the alternative to the death penalty. One could argue the zone is worse than death. It's not humane to put another being in a prison forever. What do you think, Scott?
Look, we want to take it seriously. It's a philosophical idea, which I'm going to maintain throughout is probably a slightly silly thing to do. I do slightly silly things all the time, so let's go for it. And my problem with the Phantom Zone is not that there exists a prison, a place to incarcerate those who will do others harm, if not so contained. It's that it is a convict island. You're just thrown in there and have a nice life. There's no mechanisms to protect prisoners from each other. There's no mechanisms for rehabilitation. My comic experiences of the Phantom Zone are that it's a fairly spacious universe and all the antisocial assholes can live on their own little asteroid and not bother anybody if they don't want to and just sitting there by themselves and seething until inevitably whatever happens to free them and they get their chance and then they fight Superman for a while and then go back. It's not a rehabilitative system. It's punitive.
Basically, the Phantom Zone is Krypton's equivalent of Australia.
Absolutely.
I feel both maligned and empowered by that observation. The Supergirl movie with Helen Slater actually showed us what it was like inside the Phantom Zone when she got sent there. You're absolutely right. It's a punitive rather than a rehabilitative system.
Sorry to interrupt. If you're still here, it would mean the world to me if you could please give this video a like. If you'd like to subscribe and join us for more conversations, that would be fantastic. All of Scott's and my conversations will have thumbnails with both of my pictures of us in the corners. Back to it.
Batman. I really believe that Batman's one defining trait is that he does not kill people. And again, as we cherry pick the continuity, but I believe that Batman to me is probably the best example of the journey of a character from his inception, where he was using a gun until the editor came along and told Bill Finger, no, Batman can never use a gun, even though the Shadow used a gun, because we need him to appeal to kids more. And I feel over the course of the character's career that he has very much evolved to exist within the comics code as a fully fleshed character that will, ironically, is quite happy to break all sorts of laws. But the one rule that I think he doesn't break is not killing. Let's go back to Nolan's trilogy. Batman Begins, he leaves Ra's al Ghul to die. And for me, I still feel that not choosing to save someone is still killing them. Where do you weigh in on that?
A lie by omission, you could argue less of a lie, but it's still a lie. And in the same basis, you could argue perhaps some degree less moral culpability. But we are talking degrees. You are still morally culpable. You putting out your hand would save a life, and that life does not get saved.
I do feel that there is some level of responsibility there. Like if he was held to trial, I feel like people would be like, you weren't necessarily obliged to save him, but not saving him doesn't necessarily paint you as a good guy. And this is after that great moment in Batman Begins where he refuses to kill the murderer when Ra's al Ghul confronts him with in the mountain.
It bothers me actually much more that Batman kills than almost any other superhero. Maybe if Spider-Man was out there slitting throats, that would take number one. Until we see that on screen, I'm going to complain about Batman because his whole raison d'etre is the death of his parents. He is a product of gun violence. The reason he's doing what he's doing is that somebody made that decision and he's out there to stop that happening and doing it himself. Seems really counterintuitive. It doesn't work in reverse. If Batman kills, then he's morally culpable for not killing the Joker after the Joker's, say, second escape. First, would try a different cell. After he's got out the second time and gone on a murder spree, at that point, a Batman who kills would, to me, be morally obligated to kill the Joker. That is the only way to prevent further senseless death. And what's heroic about that?
He's forced to endlessly bring these rogues back. Again and again, it's this sort of Sisyphean tragedy birthed from his trauma that he's forced to do to keep himself going, that he knows these rogues are going to get out again.
So the necessity of episodic storytelling means that you never really get that satisfying resolution that you do at the end of a novel or a movie that's designed to be a singular experience. You don't get the happily ever after and the Joker rotted to death in prison moment. You simply can't resolve all of the characters' anxieties and flaws at any time. You can't bring a character to a moment like that unless you're just a standalone little thing, which you can do in an Elseworld story or a standalone movie. And if you've got a good enough story, it'll work.
The other thing that I feel is really definitive about Batman is his tools, his weapons. They're not killing weapons. If you assume that Batman will kill, then why on earth would he need anything in his utility belt other than a goddamn gun? But if he's trying not to kill, suddenly all that stuff suddenly starts making sense.
There's an era of Iron Man where he has roller skates. Don't last very long, but you can try goofy things. Batman's utility belt and his gadgets are way more than goofy roller skates. They're an expression of his ingenuity, his self-reliance, his resources. And none of that means a thing if you're going to just at the end of the story pull out a common weapon and brutally gun down your opponent, or gently gun down your opponent, or regretfully gun down your opponent. At the end of the day, you're gunning down your opponent, and it's not what superheroes should be.
It's, again, one of those things where if you undermine the totality of the character and the concept of the character, and I understand the utility belt has been lampooned with the anti-back shark spray and stuff like that, and it was very much a crutch for writers who did not have the time or passion for the character to solve story points. But again, it's one of those things that has evolved over time to become something that, as you said, is an expression of the character in his deepest beliefs to save life. Which also brings me to Jim Gordon. Why would the commissioner of the police, the guy who at one point in The Killing Joke had his daughter paralyzed and was tortured by the perp, the Joker, insist he be brought in by the book? Gordon knows Batman would never cross that line and betray him. And for all the laws that Batman breaks, I feel on another level is that Batman knows that he would never betray Gordon, that there's a fundamental link between the two men because of that code.
I think that's the best way to express the relationship, certainly. The one that rings truest, and the one that's most inspiring, most worth reading. It is possible, I think, to tell the story of that relationship with a murdering Batman. but I don't think it works anywhere near as well. And it doesn't feel as true without Batman's moral code. I don't think anybody needs to relitigate the Zack Snyder understand Batman or Superman conversation. I think the answer is pretty clearly no. And the biggest culprit is one of comics' greatest visionaries. It's Frank Miller. The Dark Knight Returns, being the influential book it is, has warped the superhero classic ideal profoundly. We're still grappling with the effects of that work almost 40 years on. And it's good art.
It is good art. These dark, cynical trips that we saw all our superheroes going on after 1986's The Dark Knight. And I'm really keen to see someone pursue things in the other direction with the same level of complexity.
An underrated 90s comic book, which is not a phrase you hear very often, is Shadowhawk, because Jim Valentino's really trying to have a dialogue with these ideas with that character. For those who aren't familiar, Shadowhawk is a sort of Batman-inspired vigilante whose gimmick was that he broke spines. And there's a non-lethal, but rather final solution to the problem of street crime, and a ridiculous way to interrogate the Frank Millerism of it all, as superheroes stop being super heroic and move more towards vigilantism on whatever spectrum that is. A Superman to Punisher spectrum, shall we say.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the Punisher, because here's the comparison that if Batman kills, he really is just the Punisher with ears and a different symbol on his chest. There is no difference between the two characters for me. It is absolutely essential that Batman doesn't kill. You mentioned a character earlier that I think is the last standing pure white superhero. And I agree with you. I think it's Spider-Man. Spider-Man is the last pure white superhero as far as I'm concerned. One of the big differences between the Marvel and the DC continuity is the Marvel continuity is, correct me if I'm wrong, still intact from 1963. Like one continuous tapestry, whereas the DC one has been cut multiple times.
Individual heroes or groups have been pocketed off. The two main examples of that, Heroes Reborn, where the Avengers and Fantastic Four side of things went to a pocket universe for 12 months and got rebooted. And the other one is Age of Apocalypse, where the X-Men universe went into an alternate future storyline. But after these less than a year-long experiments, they all came back. And at all times, the Marvel universe was running alongside, just without those characters at the time.
It's funny because we were talking about the responsibility of death of Batman leaving Ra's al Ghul at the end of Batman Begins. And I feel that also falls into a similar level of culpability that Peter feels when towards Uncle Ben. I just feel like there's a character that's really surrounded by death. And I also notice, like, when you also compare with his cinematic universe, almost all his villains have survived in the comics, or at least survived for a very long time. I know Norman Osborn has died and come back. I feel like it is a dangerous career to be a Spider-Man. Sam Raimi is directing your film. Hobgoblin kills himself, follows that comics code thing where he becomes the agent of his own death. Dr. Octopus sort of sacrifices himself. Eddie Brock is blown up with the symbiote when Spider-Man goes to destroy it. Harry dies in the hospital as a villain, but redeemed. I think it's only the Sandman that manages to get away from in that trilogy.
And he was coded grey anyway. He was a reluctant criminal. You were supposed to sympathize with rather than wish to see their comeuppance given.
And for all of Mark Webb's amazing Spider-Man's films problems, for me, they have some real highlights. Some of just my favorite action sequences with Spider-Man. I really love Garfield when he was in the suit. I think it's really only Electro that dies in those. Connors gets cured. God, even Harry survives. He gets put in prison. And the Rhino survives. So I think it's only Electro that dies in those.
You know, again, that was for purely commercial reasons because they were bringing those villains back. And the plan at the time was for a standalone Sinister Six film for some reason, and then have them go against Spidey.
Coming to previous track records, I actually really love John Watts' Spider-Man trilogy so far for the way that it portrays Peter. Like the moment in the first one, Homecoming. God, I gotta get the name. I'm blessed to work on all three of them, and I still get them all mixed up. Homecoming, where Peter not only defeats the Vulture, but then tries so hard to save him at the end, was just total Peter Parker for me. That is one of the moments that I just absolutely love that I felt was just so Spider-Man. As I always say, those films do not resemble any Spider-Man comic I've ever read, yet feel like Peter Parker so intrinsically to me.
Fantastic adaptations of the character, not the literal stories themselves. And nor should it, because this Spider-Man exists in a very different universe and has a suit for very different reasons than he did. The Raimi films, still my favorite Spideys, but I think Tom Holland is actually my favorite Spider-Man. He's certainly my favorite Peter Parker. The Tobey Maguire was more a throwback to the Ditko Ramita Peter Parker. It all seemed a bit out of time and a bit hyper-real, whereas Holland feels like Peter Parker, but a modern Peter Parker, a kid from today.
When you look at John Watts' trilogy, you have Mysterio suffering the Goblin Glider incident where he ends up killing himself. And while I didn't love Spider-Man No Way Home, the film, the idea of resting a film on the whole idea that Peter will not kill people, not even send them back to their destined death, is just so wonderful to me. And when he is confronted with grief and anguish himself, that he manages to work through that, through other versions of himself, saving him from himself in that way. I just think it's absolutely strong legs to build a superhero movie from. And to me, just keeps Spider-Man absolutely intact and leaves him as the only last, in my mind, pure white superhero left.
Cinematically, I think that's very true. I don't think it's a coincidence that he's the youngest. I don't think we'll be seeing Ms. Marvel beheading people. Would I be shocked if Captain Marvel let out an anguished scream as she force blasted some alien's head off? No, I wouldn't.
When you look at Captain America and the First Avenger, one of the things about him is that he is in a war. And that's one of the reasons why I was able to bring my head around that and just go, look, superhero or hero, if you're in a war, you as a soldier are trained to kill. That is, you're not trained to pacify. When I look at the idea of hero, at one point I even looked it up in the Oxford Dictionary. Let me read it. A person who is admired or idealized for courage, outstanding achievements, or noble qualities. I think that absolutely defines soldiers for me. You have the courage to go through training and be deployed and follow orders and do all those things. And so I guess the question I ask is then, would a super soldier be better at killing? The website had Cap killing 54 people if you believe that when he shield smashes someone to the face that they died. So even if he just knocked them out and you got half that number, it's still a significant body count for a superhero to put together in a superhero film.
I would not count a shield to the face. I refuse to believe that Cap can't pull his punch enough to make that a non-lethal blow, if that's his object. My take on this, on Captain America during wartime is this. He was a soldier. And he wanted to be a soldier before the chance of being a super one would even occurred to him. He tried very hard to be a soldier because of his sense of duty to his friends, to his country, to the cause of, we want to color it down to the movie motivation, standing up to bullies. He didn't want to kill people, but that was the job. Now, killing people, I've never done it, has ramifications on the person who does it. So this is something tens of thousands of his fellow soldiers are going to have to do on a near daily basis and deal with. There is no way Steve is going to skip through the wall with his brightly colored shield, just knocking out people, while his comrades in arms are walking along behind him, plugging away the ones, because they don't have those advantages. They don't have any choice. Steve would pick up a gun and kill and bear that burden with his fellow soldiers. And then when the war is over, put down the gun and not use it. And I don't actually see a contradiction there. If you go to war, you go to war.
One of the things, though, then, is Captain America the First Avenger, then, a superhero movie? I would almost argue that for a great part of it, we're looking at a super soldier movie. And I would almost even say that the majority of the Marvel films, to me, are super soldier movies rather than superhero movies. And when I say super soldier, I put them in the same category as action movies like Rambo or Commando, characters that have extra normal abilities and capacities to kill people. And one of the things that I was wrestling with, what makes a superhero story, let alone comic or just in any media. I think that there needs to be the difference between vigilantism and superheroes is that there needs to be some sort of moral quandary, that it needs to be a story of emotional and moral conflict. And I don't necessarily believe that there is one in the first Avenger, whereas I believe that all good Spider-Man stories have him wrestling with that sort of moral quandary. I'm looking at all these MCU films. I literally call them super soldier stories rather than superhero stories. And I think it's why I really enjoyed the John Watts trilogy for what it was, because it really felt like superhero movies to me. And you're absolutely right. It is the youth of Peter Parker definitely helping usher that idea from the comics code in. Still think there's opportunity for adults to do that too.
Once again, the MCU isn't adapting the 616. Certainly at the start, they're adapting the Ultimates. Those are the Ultimate characters, and none of whom were heroes. All of whom were spies or soldiers or conscripted as such, with the exception of Stark, who was Tony Stark. He was involved in that world previously to Iron Man regardless. They explicitly work for S.H.I.E.L.D. in the Ultimates and in the MCU. The Triskelion is a creation of the Ultimates. The version of Tony Stark we get is closer to the Ultimate Tony Stark. The version of Cap we get is halfway in between. The Ultimate Cap is a bit more rough and tumble from his war experiences. The MCU Cap is a little closer to the pure guy that we grew up with in the 616. It's not adapting superheroes. They're adapting super soldiers.
You spoke before about the Ultimate Cap versus the M616 Cap. And I really feel this is the spirit and the personality of 616 Steve Rogers in the Ultimate's body and situation. And I love that. I just absolutely love that. It had tremendous heart. And for me, that just means a lot.
You could argue Cap, who is super and heroic, but his heroic moment is not anything to do with his powers. His powers are what put him in that position. Heroism is Steve being Steve. It's not really super heroism. I'd argue Iron Man's sacrifice play in Avengers is where he steps up and becomes a superhero. Same with Widow and Hawkeye until they step into that unwinnable fight. And when they become superheroes.
Yeah, they really do exist in this place of super soldier before you become superhero.
Iron Man 1 and 2, Tony's basically cleaning up his own mess. The way the story is told to us, he's on the right side of that. He's not leaping onto any grenades at any point. The Hulk is just trying to survive and find a cure. It's not any great heroism. It really is the Avengers where they become superheroes. And not only did that sort of change cinema in a way, it changed the MCU certainly and introduced superheroes. I would go so far as to suggest that only superhero movies like the Spider-Man trilogy have ever really bothered with the superheroes don't kill thing.
Yeah.
I think superheroes in cinema have always been a bit more bloodthirsty than the children's reading material counterpart.
One of the things that I think about when I talk about should superheroes kill is that it's so interesting what a different perception everybody has of their hero. There are thousands of Spider-Man and Batman comics, and they come out every month, and you've got your TV shows and your movies, and I realize that everybody has a unique perception of these characters, and I almost call it a buffet of the mythology, because you just take from that continuity, even of what you've read, you just choose what really applies to you and what doesn't.
I did the read through from issue 1 to whatever the current issue was. It's now 60 years. Once you try to assimilate that as a single cohesive narrative, it doesn't always work very well. And sometimes the contradictions get addressed and tidied up, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes the stories work, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes the characters feel true, and sometimes they don't. There's too much material, and there's too much of it that was banged out in an afternoon because the book had to go to the press for it to really be a cohesive work. So you pick and choose what matters. You pick and choose what you think about, what resonates. You pick and choose what you go back to. And you pick and choose what you recommend to people who aren't going to read 50 years worth of newsprint pamphlets.
A lot of American comics are published monthly, and that book has to come out on that date, especially a flagship title like The Avengers. And sometimes you don't have enough time to dot all the I's, cross all the T's, make every character interaction feel true, make every plot point tie up, make every action earned. It's just simply not possible. Sometimes you get it. Usually it's from a creator that is being brought onto the book for the first time, that has had an idea gestating for a very long time. But when you're in that monthly grind, it's impossible. It is like running a marathon and trying to keep up with Ethiopians. And what you get then is stories that aren't always as tight. And I closed the gap in my mind. I remember there was like a thing talking about fandoms where weak fandoms tear apart the mistakes that they see and really strong fandoms fill in the gaps. So Star Trek, for example, is a very strong fandom. When there's problems with the technology or the science or the time or whatever, the fandom will come in and fix the problem there. And I think we do that a lot also with comics. We give them a lot of leeway.
I like the idea of strong fandom pulling together and weak fandom pulling apart. I'm not sure the map to strength is the right metaphor, but I do like the idea. Comics used to feel a little different. Now, I don't know for sure whether that's just because I was different. Things like bullpen bulletins and the checklist in every Marvel book, even if you could only buy one or two of them, it felt like you knew what was more or less what was going on in this larger world, and that you were a part of that world. Now all of that just happens online, and it's directly fan to fan, and every fan's experience is so unique. I'm not surprised we butt heads.
We really do butt heads, and it's so interesting the different ways that people, for me, anything that sort of contradicts what I feel is the core idea of the character that isn't earned, I just put in a little pocket dimension that I'm aware of, but I don't let that affect my perception of the character in that way. Another way, I think in DC Comics, I just acknowledge whatever the latest continuity is, that if the character hasn't done that in the latest continuity, I ignore that. But either ways, both are just very messy and very personal in the way that you perceive this continuity. It's funny you mentioned that things feel different, because I actually think they were. And the reason for that, it really pains me to say this, because I had an uncomfortable realization of why I believe what defines superhero comics for me. And I think it was the Comics Code. For those of you who don't know, very quickly, Dr. Frederick Wortham published a book called Seduction of the Innocent, managed to also seduce all of America that comics were the root of all evil in our children. There were a bunch of hearings, and also at the time you had the HUAC trials and McCarthy going rampant with anti-communism. And the comics industry decided to self-police themselves to create a Comics Code authority that then create the Comics Code. And unfortunately, that code really targeted EC Comics and just tore the absolute guts out of that company, but allowed the superhero to rise.
Look, it's a common dodge in the US creative industries. Hollywood did the same thing with the Hays Code, self-policed all their content. And all the major players agreed to a charter. It satisfied the wolves at their door, and it had the byproduct of killing most of their commercial rivals as well.
I think this self-policing idea forced a whole trope into our stories where they had to find ways around the hero not killing the villain. And the villain could be killed by themselves or inadvertently or by accident, but not actually by the hero. By knowing that there wasn't going to be a death, that these stories instead became stories of morality, stories of good overcoming evil, of heroes being defined over the course of decades. And very much in the case of someone like Batman, of changing over the course of time so that his character fit inside the Comics Code. And this sort of code washing of all the heroes for me is something that I felt defined my perception of superhero comics.
The codification, unintended, of the Comics Code probably helped enforce that. But these decisions were ultimately, in my opinion, commercial in nature. If fans liked the Joker and you kill the Joker, you can't bring him back 6 issues later and tempt those fans to buy the book again. As heroes developed the Rogues Gallery, villains needed to come back. I think it's honestly got more to do with the idea that comics were for children. And the idea of children and childhood as this special sacred period in life was, historically speaking, still relatively new. And we're still culturally negotiating with what that space means. And the things that were de rigueur in our childhood would horrify modern parents. And I'm sure there's a little bit of vice versa with that too. If you're aiming things at children, then children are children because they don't have all of the tools necessary to handle nuance, gray area, complex discussions, and they need absolutes and respond to absolute. You can't just kill people seems like a good absolute for me.
Yeah.
But I think the Comics Code was a byproduct of these forces rather than the force itself. But it's certainly a good token that represents that view.
I very much feel like the Comics Code was the walls of the sandpit and defining the material you're playing with. But I also think that there have been incredible stories. And I think of a lot of Alan Moore's Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow, as well as just a whole bunch of stuff that Chick Giordano and Neil Adams and others were doing within that space. And George Perez, and God, the list is endless, where people are creating these gorgeous palaces out of sand. Like not just castles, but palaces that any adult could walk past and go, oh my God, that is incredible. Where it's not just for kids. For me, when I saw those heights of comic books, that has really inspired my journey and desire to become a comic book creator. I almost enjoy those limits. And I would actually say that this pressure of the Comics Code, eventually the industry was able, and the creators were able to find a real way to work inside it, to create stories that, yes, were absolutely for children, but I believe still have incredible artistic merit nonetheless.
Absolutely. I don't think being for children disqualifies you from being, for instance, see most of the Pixar catalog. There was certainly a lot of creativity in walking up to the line of the Comics Code authority. And the other force that was really pushing comics to mature was the rise of the fan in the industry. When in the golden age, those adult creators were writing for children without a template beyond, obviously, the historical precedents of newspaper strips and pulp stories, which had already proven popular. So it's not like they were working blind, but nonetheless, they didn't have any real examples of this medium that they hadn't grown up on it. But by the time we get to the 60s, we get people like Roy Thomas, the first ascended fanboy. And then by the time we get to the 80s, virtually the entire Marvel office was fanboys, run by the most successful fan of all time, Jim Shooter, who started working at DC 14.
You're absolutely right when it comes to the Pixar thing. You have a piece of media that is designed for children that still has absolute artistic merit. And I think there's a whole bunch of comic books within that time that do have merit. And I feel, though, that for me, that those limitations, and almost to say that those Pixar limitations almost apply to a lot of the Marvel comics that I read. I don't have anything more to add.
We got there in the end.
We did get there in the end.
Thank you again for sticking around. If you want to see my comic book work, please check out Joker Harley Criminal Sanity Volume 1, available at your local comic shop or on Amazon.com. Swing by Lindsay Sterling's merch stand at one of her concerts and pick up Artemis, the graphic novel that we co-wrote and co-art directed together. I also did all the layouts. You can also pick it up online at lindsaysterling.com. I've got a Patreon where I throw out different stuff every month at every different level if you'd like to help support me and my work. Oh, and swing by jasonbadower.com and check out my upcoming con schedule. Come visit me. Come have a chat. And lastly and leastly, if you've got a second to chuck this video a like, that would be absolutely amazing. And please subscribe if you want to do this dance again. In my next video, I'll be doing a deep dive into Are Marvel Movies Theme Park Rides by analyzing Iron Man 2. In the meantime, there's plenty of other videos that'll keep you going. Thank you again. How do you hang out with your friends? Restaurants, bars, clubs, maybe over at someone's house, just staring at a TV screen, or just sort of hanging out? And if you sit around watching a movie, that's cool, but you're not really talking. I still, hand on my heart, believe that the best way to hang out with your friends is to play a role-playing game. Unlike a board game, role-playing games are not competitive. They are cooperative. You and your friends actually hanging out and creating stories and moments you'll look back on and laugh at together. But the worst thing about role-playing games is getting started. There's a lot of rules, and being the games master takes a heck of a lot of preparation time each week. Enter GameMastersForHire.com. If you've always wanted to play Dungeons & Dragons, GameMastersForHire.com are experts at teaching you all the rules while taking you on an epic adventure. And if you're loving it, you can play the same character every session, who will then get more and more powerful. If you're a wannabe dungeon or game master, there's no faster way to learn and be great at it than booking a training session with GameMastersForHire.com. For the experienced D&D groups out there, if you're looking for a special birthday gift for your DM, the best gift you can give is to let them be a player for a change by booking a birthday adventure. GameMastersForHire.com will make sure the guest of honor is treated like a hero on their special day. Game Masters for Hire can also run games for anyone, from dinner parties to kids' parties, corporate events, bachelor or bachelorette nights, to ongoing campaigns every week where you play the same character every session. It's like a story that you're building with your friends. GameMastersForHire.com are available online, which is how I play with them. But if you live in the greater Los Angeles area, they can do in-person games with miniatures and sets that'll blow your mind. Please visit GameMastersForHire.com for more information. Reach out to Ollie and his team and they'll help you out, whatever you need. And just like going out to dinner, split the cost between the lot of you. I'll even kick in. Just use my offer code BADOWER for 10% off your first game. I promise you're going to have an amazing time that you'll always remember. Thank you, GameMastersForHire.com, for sponsoring this video. During our conversation, Scott and I were talking about an absolutely fantastic Superman comic that you should read, and we never mentioned what it was. It is Superman in Action Comics number 775 by Joe Kelly, Doug Monkey, Lee Bermeo, more inkers than you can poke a stick at, and John Schwager on inks, and the fellows at Comic Craft on lettering. This is fantastic. Now I'm going to take you through the first few pages. This may look like standard comic book fare. It is absolutely not. It is so much more than that. It is one of the greatest insights into Superman. This is Lee Bermeo's artwork on the left and Doug Monkey's artwork on the right, both two of my favorite artists of all time. This is absolutely the best commentary on Superman that I've seen in many, many years, and I highly recommend it. If you think Superman is outdated and old and past his prime and doesn't have any relevance anymore, go pick this up from Amazon.com for a couple bucks right now.